Gardeners in the know are familiar with nitrogen-fixing plants, but most people have never even heard of them. Imagine a plant that will add fertilizer into the soil so that your fruit trees and vegetables will grow even better without you having to do any of the work? Well, that's what nitrogen fixers do. Gardens in Hawaii can greatly benefit from incorporating nitrogen fixers into their landscape. With the cost of fertilizer running sky high, if they're even available, having a way to produce your own fertilizer will go a long way to ensure that your food forest will thrive. Today, I'm going to go over nitrogen fixers for a tropical food forest. So if you live in Hawaii or in the tropics somewhere and you're starting out a garden, you're going to want to watch this video. Now, there are a few benefits to having nitrogen fixers in your garden. Besides being able to take out nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil for your plants to feed on, they have a few other things that they do. Shade is one of them. This is an ice cream bean here behind me, and it provides great shade here in my garden. In the summer months, it's able to provide shade for the young fruit trees, and in the winter, I prune it heavily so that the sun is allowed to come in. When you plant nitrogen-fixing trees at the same time as you plant young fruit trees, you're giving those young fruit trees a better chance at being able to survive. They naturally grow in partial shade and then compete for the canopy. And having a nitrogen-fixing tree provide that partial shade goes a long way in establishing your food forest. Nitrogen-fixing trees also provide a good source of mulch. Here in the tropics, where our soil is thin to non-existent, having a tree that produces a bunch of mulch material allows us to build soil really quickly. Nitrogen-fixing plants respond to heavy pruning. So every year we cut down these nitrogen-fixing plants and lay their branches and their leaves and their twigs and everything around the fruit trees so that they can decompose and provide mulch there. And pretty quickly the tree just sprouts right back up and you have what you see behind me. So now you have a source of mulch that you didn't have to go off-site to get. You had it growing right here in your very own garden. And that mulch helps feed your fruit trees and helps suppress the weeds at the same time. It's a total win-win having a nitrogen-fixing tree. And not only that, many nitrogen-fixing trees produce food as well. The ice cream bean tree produces an edible pod that my kids love. There's also nitrogen fixers like tamarind or kiave that also produce edible pods that you can eat. Then there's smaller plants like pigeon peas or peas or beans that produce edible bean pods for you to consume. So many great uses from nitrogen-fixing plants. Why aren't they in your garden yet? Animal livestock seem to love nitrogen fixers. I just had sheep in my garden and they ate up almost every ice cream bean leaf they could reach. Any other nitrogen fixer was quickly consumed. Cows, goats, sheep, they're all animals that can benefit from having nitrogen fixers intermixed within their pasture. And that would also help hold in soil and create a more mixed system that is more healthy overall for both the land and the animals. Other benefits these nitrogen-fixing plants have is that you can use them as a living fence. Their roots tend to dig down really deep and break up rock and create soil. And also some species are really good to use in building projects that can give a building project a more natural feel. So that's a whole bunch on why you should be planting nitrogen fixers in your garden. But why would you want to think about not planting nitrogen fixers in your garden? A lot of people say that they are invasive, and that is true with many nitrogen fixers. So you have to be sure that you find out whether or not your tree is invasive where you live. Where I live here, ice cream bean is a great nitrogen fixer. It does not spread really easily. It does spread from seed, but as long as you manage it properly, those seeds don't go very far. Pigeon Pea is another great nitrogen fixer I haven't seen to go wild. In fact, I have to plant it by hand most of the time. But then you could have other nitrogen fixers like Albizia, which is a highly invasive weed tree here in East Hawaii. And if you have that growing on your property, you might as well just cut that down. Unless you really know what you're doing and you manage that tree perfectly, because it can escape and go rampant and it has caused havoc. And when it comes to how these miracle trees actually work, nitrogen fixing plants have a beneficial relationship with a group of bacteria, and with that relationship it's able to take nitrogen out of the air and store it in its leaves, in its branches, and in the roots. Now the bacteria colonize the roots and store the nitrogen that gets caught by the tree, and then the bacteria takes home in the roots of the plant, where it stores the nitrogen that gets absorbed by the tree, and forms these little white root nodules that are pink inside when you cut through them. The bacteria inoculate the roots of the nitrogen-fixing plants, housing themselves on the root and forming these little white balls called nodules. To ensure that your soil has rhizobia, it's common practice to inoculate the soil with mycorrhizal fungi at the time of planting. You can tell that a plant is fixing nitrogen if you inspect the roots and find the little white balls, the nodules that are formed, and then cut them in half. And if they're pink inside, that means they're fixing nitrogen. Okay, so let's go over a few types of plants here in the tropics that we can use as nitrogen fixers. But before we do, why don't you go ahead and plant something of your own, your finger, down on that like button and help this channel grow. Every time you plant your finger, it really helps these videos go out to more people. So please plant that finger down there. All right, the first plant, obviously, ice cream bean tree. It's one of my favorites. It grows really quick. It's not very invasive here in East Hawaii, and it responds really well from heavy pruning. It also produces an edible seed pod that's kind of like a cotton candy that the kids really love. The seeds of the tree are really big, so it's highly unlikely that the wind is going to be able to blow them away. They actually just fall straight down to the ground, and when they sprout, they tend to sprout right under the tree. Ice cream bean trees can do really well as a living fence since they can be coppiced so much, and they provide decent lumber. The ice cream bean wood is a little more dense than other nitrogen fixing trees, so I like to use it in the fire pit. Okay, you also have your infamous Albizia tree. Around here in East Hawaii, the Albizia is super invasive. It grows to be like a couple 100 feet tall or something. The branches break really easy. The trees fall down. They just create havoc. So most people want to get rid of Albizia as quick as possible. But if you have Albizia growing on your property, you probably have really good soil, because Albizias are known to turn rock into dirt, and they do a fantastic job at it. Unfortunately, a full-size Albizia costs a lot to remove, so if you have one of these trees, be ready to pay for it. Now, if you were working with a small space that was highly managed and you had Albizias sprouting up, you could use them to coppice regularly and use the leaves as a mulch in your garden. They provide a lot of nitrogen, but you have to be sure that you never let the tree go to flower, because these seeds do disperse by wind and they will go everywhere. So the best common practice is just to cut them down and have another nitrogen fixing tree like an ice cream bean tree that doesn't cause problems. If you want to go local, there is Koa. Koa is a local nitrogen fixing tree that grows more in the higher elevations. And there is also another lowland version of the Koa, which grows in the drier parts of the islands, that produces and fixes nitrogen as well. The Koa tree is traditionally prized for its wood. Surfboards and canoes have been made from this wood, and people love to use it in their home construction these days. It's a highly sought after, valuable wood. Whereas the lowland Koa is more of a scrubby Koa cousin to the Koa that is not nearly as valuable for its wood, but does great being burned. So it's great for the fireplace. Now, these native plants would be a great addition to any landscape that's either in higher elevations on the wet side or in lower elevations on the dry side, where they need a native plant to fix nitrogen. If we have a native plant that we can grow instead of a non-native, go ahead and choose that one first. Besides producing valuable wood, Koa also has flowers that bees love, so you get a really great honey off of these trees. Next, we have Phaya, or fire tree. Phaya is a highly invasive tree that I would not recommend for anyone to grow. It's kind of a scrubby tree that's not really that great looking of a tree. Some people will suggest you to grow this tree, but I would suggest against it. If you're in the mid to higher elevations, Phaya can run rampant, and just having it in your garden will be more of a nuisance than it's worth. It can fill a great niche as sort of a smaller tree or shrub within your food forest, but unless you know how to manage it properly, you should not even mess with it. There's so many great trees for us to grow. There's also the Madre de Cacao, traditionally used as a shade tree in cacao and coffee plantations. The Madre de Cacao is a great nitrogen fixer for your garden. It often goes by the name Gliricidia in Hawaii. I think I pronounced that right. The tree is also used as animal fodder for mulch material, for fence posts, and rat poison. With as many rats as we have around here in Hawaii, and with the problem of rat lungworm disease, if a tree like Glurcidia will help kill off rats, then maybe we should all plant one, yeah? This tree responds really well to hard pruning. You could prune it back to a twig and it'll start to resprout. It does have a potential of being invasive, but not as much as the Albizia. And this tree prefers the more dry forest type areas of all the island. Okay, and our last tree is a tree that was once commonly planted here in Hawaii, but not so much anymore. You'll see some really old species in places like the Punulu Bake Shop down in South Point. They have a really big tamarind tree. Tamarind trees are more popular in places like India. It produces a really sour bean pod. They make sour candy out of it, and they use it as a flavoring in curries and other foods like that. The tree loves to grow on the leeward side of the islands. It's pretty tolerant to drought. The flowers make bees flock to it. So the tree not only produces the edible seed pod, but it produces valuable wood for furniture making. It could be used as a medicine, as animal fodder, and as a metal polish. It's kind of crazy that these trees ever fell out of fashion because they have so many uses for the off-grid homestead. All right, I told you this was gonna be all about nitrogen fixers, and we're gonna get into shrubs now. Starting us off with our first shrub is Saspania. It's a small tree or shrub that has edible bean pods, leaves, and seeds. It's a perfect plant to put in the mid-understory layer of a food forest. It's best planting these at the beginning of a rainy season, and within 9 months, you'll start to have bean pods ready to eat. And like the rest of the nitrogen fixers on this list, they can sustain heavy pruning. So don't be afraid to cut them back pretty hard. In fact, you'll probably need to do that to keep them in check. Now there's another Saspania that is native to Hawaii. It's called Saspania tomentosa. It grows well in the lowland areas as a ground cover or a shrub. It fixes nitrogen, but it doesn't have any edible parts. Both of these Saspania prefer to grow in drier parts of the islands. Another shrub for the list is Rattlepod. Rattlepods are pretty common in a lot of gardens out here. Sometimes they just volunteer and show up. Rattlepods are great at fixing nitrogen and building soil. These plants are really high in protein, and they act as a great fodder plant for animals. I have this plant growing as a volunteer in many places. It seems to thrive in the wet, windward areas of all the islands. Okay, another very popular nitrogen fixing plant that we have on the list is the pigeon pea. Many of you probably heard of the pigeon pea before. It grows great in the vegetable garden, mixed in as a shrub, and also as an understory species in a food forest. Pigeon peas produce a lot of edible seed pods that are really popular throughout the tropics already. You can dry the seeds, you can can them, or you can eat them fresh. They're really a great plant to have in the garden. And they're great at building soil and fixing nitrogen into that soil. So if you're looking for a plant to add to your garden, pigeon pea is a good all-around plant to include. There's still yet another layer of nitrogen fixers that are out there in the plant world, the ground cover layer. Right now I'm standing in a bed of Perennial Peanut, a very popular tropical ground cover that fixes nitrogen out here. Perennial Peanut is a great ground cover for more of the food forest orchard setting, and one that should stay out of any annual production areas. It can spread and really dig in. It's hard to take out once it's established. Perennial Peanut, once established, grows really quickly. It's a great animal fodder. The bees love the flowers when they're in bloom. And Perennial Peanut does a great job at producing nitrogen and soil. But don't confuse this plant with the peanut that you're used to in the store. It does not produce edible peanuts. Another ground cover that's nitrogen fixing is Desmodium. Desmodium is typically used as a green manure in agriculture. Gardeners will till it into the soil so that it can fix nitrogen and improve fertility for annual crops. Animals love to eat it as a fodder. Cows and goats will just decimate it. So if you're looking for a good cover crop for your garden, a Desmodium could be one for you to think about. Now the last ground cover on the list is a Hawaii native, Nanea. Nanea grows on the salty, sandy beaches up to 1,500 feet. It's related to black-eyed peas and mung beans. It tends to grow as a trailing vine and doesn't really get too invasive. It's more slow growing, but it does a great job at producing nitrogen and has been known to be used medicinally to cure ulcers and other ailments of the body. So if you live in the lowland areas on the leeward side of the islands, you may want to consider adding Nanea to your garden as a native nitrogen food fixing plant. Well, I hope you like that list, but before we go, I need to tell you a little more about what we're going to do with nitrogen fixers in our gardens here in the tropics. How we're going to use them. First of all, when you're designing out your garden, you want to include nitrogen fixers into that mix. And you don't want to overdo it with nitrogen fixers because you could over fix nitrogen into the soil. So before you do anything, you should get a soil test, see how much nitrogen you have. At my place, I have a ratio of 10 nitrogen fixing trees to 1 fruit tree when my garden was early on and just settling in. And now I have 1 nitrogen fixing tree with about 10 fruit trees. So the ratio reversed over time. For other gardens that have a better soil than I do, maybe 3 or 4 nitrogen fixing trees per fruit tree is what you want to do. And you can plant them individually around a fruit tree, as hedgerows through a garden, or along a living fence, or in clumps. However you want to do it, just make sure that your nitrogen fixing trees are close to where you want to add the fertility. A lot of times I like to chop my nitrogen fixing trees and just drop it to the fruit tree that's growing right next to it. I don't have to use a wheelbarrow or anything. It's all right there. The best thing to do when you're going to chop your nitrogen fixing trees is wait till they're flowering. When the nitrogen fixing trees are in the flowering stage before they go to seed, that's the best time to chop them up, because that's when you get the peak amount of nitrogen fixation into the soil. But what about the food that's about to come from those flowers? What do you do there? Well, some years you may not want to chop your nitrogen fixing tree to have that food, or you may have other ones around that go to flower so that you can harvest the fruit off that tree, and have other ones that you cut while it's still in flower. Or you don't ever harvest the fruit off the tree. It just depends on the strategy that you're trying to use. When I chop and drop these trees, sometimes I have pretty good sized branches that get left behind. I just use them as either firewood or leave them in the soil, and eventually they break down. So don't worry about throwing out any big logs or having to mulch them up. Most times they're a great addition to the garden, where insects and other garden life can find a home, and that they can slowly decay over time. Sometimes I'll use the leaves too, since they're so plentiful from a nitrogen fixing plant. I'll use the leaves in my compost pile. A way to add layers. The leaves, when I let them dry out and turn brown, and I'll add them as the brown layer to my greens that I throw in from my kitchen food waste. Now, nitrogen fixing ground covers are used a little different than trees and shrubs in the food forest. Nitrogen fixing ground covers are primarily used for their nitrogen fixing abilities and their flowering abilities that attract bees that you can make and turn into honey. So we don't tend to cut down or chop the ground covers. They tend to be a permanent layer in the food forest that helps suppress weeds and fix nitrogen and provide more food for bees so that we can have more honey. Now, there are some nitrogen fixers and other strategies where you will want to till them into the soil. Perhaps in a vegetable garden where you used it as a cover crop and now you're ready to plant a main vegetable plant. You want to till that nitrogen fixer into the soil, and that'll create a really fertile bed for whatever you plant next. So we got a nitrogen fixer for almost any instance in the garden. This was a really big video talking about a really big topic. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I hope that it was informative. It was a really dense video, but I think this was information that all of us needed to hear. We need to know more about how to use nitrogen fixers in the garden. So if you like this video, please hit the like button and comment down below. What nitrogen fixers are you using? I'd love to know. There's so many more out there. It'd be great for all of us to learn more about them. So thanks for watching. Ahui ho.